Welcome to the Music Exchange, where we deal in music, business, culture, and beyond. This is our first episode, and it's a particularly special one to me, because today we're talking to Stephen Banks, Associate Professor of Saxophone at Ithaca College. Stephen is an incredibly talented saxophonist, educator, composer, and advocate. Only 3 years out from completing his master's degree at Northwestern University, Stephen has established an ongoing relationship with the Cleveland Orchestra, having performed with them in various concerts. He's held a teaching position at Baldwin Wallace University prior to his appointment at Ithaca College, and he's the baritone saxophonist of the award-winning Canary Quintet. Stephen is also an advocate for diversity and inclusion in music education. To quote from his bio, he gave a talk at the TEDx Northwestern U 2017 conference with ideas about how to create change in institutionalized prejudices against women and people of color. Since the talk, Banks has written an article for WQXR and given guest lectures on the history of Black classical composers. Banks serves as a member of the first Committee on the Status of Women for the North American Saxophone Alliance and is proud to have been selected as a member of the jury for the first ever female saxophonist competition. This is why today's discussion is so significant. I give most of the context for this episode in the interview itself, so I won't waste too much time here. Despite it being the most recent interview I've done, I wanted to push this one to the front of the queue. I've left the conversation between Stephen and I largely unedited. I wanted to leave it unedited because I think the difficulty of addressing these issues and the many directions we go during the discussion were important to preserve. And I'm sure many of you will have your own reactions and opinions to what Stephen and I discuss. So I welcome your thoughts in the form of YouTube comments or emails sent to the email address in the notes section of this podcast. A note for our YouTube viewers, the video recording of this interview was disrupted, so we only have the audio. For those listening on your favorite podcasting platform, nothing about your experience will be disrupted. So without further ado, let's dig in. Stephen Banks, thank you for sitting down to talk to me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Well, I think some listeners would benefit from a little bit of context about sort of how we ended up sitting down today, because I reached out to you on May 18th. And yes, I checked the dates of the correspondences. Really just hoping to have a candid discussion about things I know you have been an advocate for when the two of us were at Northwestern together, which in particular was diversity and equity in a conservatory education curriculum. Mm-hmm. And, you know, we had a couple exchanges back and forth about setting this up, and it was only about a week later, crazily enough, that the George Floyd was murdered at the hands of 4 police officers. Mm-hmm. And ensuing riots and protests and sort of the grieving that would happen after such a horrific event. And now we're recording this 10 days out from that murder happening. And there has been ensuing sort of, I think, political unrest and, leadership issues that we can, spend a whole different podcast talking about. But I think what's really stood out to me is that I reached out to you just wanting to have a conversation in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. And I think now it's come from being a conversation that can just be a worthwhile discussion to have, to something that I think is a necessity. Mm-hmm. And so, to make my long introduction to this short, I'm really glad that you've decided to, still sit down with me amidst everything that's going on, because it's ugly right now.
Right. Yeah. And, to be perfectly honest, I think there were a few days where I wasn't ready to talk,
Yeah.
and I think it's interesting to think about how those few days were for Black people in
Hmm.
general. And by those few days, I mean when the tensions were heightened around the country, because it's been more than a few days. I mean, it's
Oh,
been
yeah.
a few hundred years. But
Right.
I think that in these past few days, I think the one thing that people don't understand is that um, people are and have been grieving, and the like it's not always easy to talk about stuff while you are grieving, and
No.
I've actually found myself getting into trouble because of saying things, because I'm losing that element of understanding and PC-ness
Hmm.
when I speak to people sometimes, because there is a certain truth out there that Black people have always known, but that we are trained, because we have to get by,
Hmm.
to push aside for the sake of other people's comfortability.
Hmm.
And I'm glad that we're doing this today, because basically it's been yesterday and today that I feel like I can smile,
Hmm.
or I feel like I can actually talk about these things in the context of music and feel like it actually means anything, because
Hmm.
life and death is not something that um, I think is all we're always equipped to um, deal with through music. I know for myself, like I have not played my saxophone
Hmm.
in, I don't know, a week or maybe more,
Hmm.
just because it doesn't feel right. It doesn't
Hmm.
feel like there's any musical expression that can bring so many people back to life and
Hmm.
change the perspectives of people that don't even know that their perspectives need to be changed.
Hmm.
Um, so anyway, I just say that because I'm glad that it falls today, because we can actually talk about it. I feel, you know.
Hmm. And you know what? I was coming out of this week from a very similar place
Hmm.
because, just because it seems like music has stopped because of coronavirus of all things. Um, I'm still practicing and writing and trying to, keep my own projects up. And never before have I felt so winded
Hmm.
by what's happening outside that I just really didn't feel like anything I could, you know, contribute musically was worth anything.
Hmm.
Um, that was hard, and I think, you know, it, I can only speak to this as a white person, but I think it's easy for someone in my position when you're going through um, sort of your day to day life, and everything that you talked about has been happening before. I mean, George Floyd is not the um, he's not the first. He will
Hmm.
not be the last. Um, but for someone in my position, I feel like it's easier to have taken for granted, oh, well, I just need to get on with what I'm doing, and sort of just, it's bad. Um, I wish these issues were addressed, but I need to stay focused on,
Hmm.
if I'm at school, my next class, or, if it's a job, whatever needs to get done.
Right.
And having all this time where there's no deadlines,
Hmm.
really, um, it hit different. And I realized I was able to take it for granted.
Hmm.
And now you see it um, without having the privilege, I should say, to just keep your head down and work.
Hmm.
Um, and
Right.
I, I hope I carry that feeling with me so that I don't forget,
Hmm.
how important that is. But that's all to say, I felt like I was in a place from an artistic perspective that I have not been really ever.
Mm.
Um, and so, um, yeah, I'm glad that, I can finally start to feel like I can talk about this and, sort of find ways to incorporate it, into discussions about, music
Hmm.
with the curriculum. And that's kind of where I wanted to take this now,
Sure.
because, uh, when we go through a conservatory education, and I know you've been through the Jacobs School of Music in Indiana for your bachelor's and Northwestern for your master's degree, which is where we met.
Hmm.
Um, and I sort of noticed in my own conservatory education, absent of this being necessarily pointed out, that it's just a very, I mean, the word is canonized, but it's just a very um, rock solid, immutable sort of lineage that you're
Hmm.
taught in these um, in music theory courses and music history courses. And, you know, eh, it, to think about it that way and to sort of see that, um, it's odd that really in my immediate experience with folks around me or among professors, um, in my own education, that never really seemed to be questioned all that much. And it's sort of just taken for granted again that that's just what it is and that's what you study. You go
Right.
from Bach to Mozart to Beethoven to whomever. But even as you start moving into 20th century music, where, you know, I feel to an extent contributions of Black, Asian, Latino, female, all kinds of diverse arrays of composers are more obvious because we have better record keeping and it wasn't actively destroyed in certain circumstances. Um, it's still not really questioned. Um,
Hmm.
and I just wonder if in your own education, going through Jacobs, which is not an institution I was a part of, um, you had felt that at any point, that it was just sort of taken for granted. And I guess more importantly, because of your own advocacy for these kinds of issues, where did it start for you where you realized, I kind of need to address this, or I need to talk about this finally?
Yeah, sure. So in undergrad, it was not there. I did not even think about this at all. I was
Mm-hmm.
much like you in that I didn't question, um, because I just was always taught that you have to be better than to be equal to.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't necessarily understand that I was taught that growing up bec- because of my race, not completely because of my race, of course, but um, in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I just always, and I should also say that that was coupled with me just not feeling good enough in a lot of different ways, like as
Mm-hmm.
a musician, as a academic, you know, participant in classes, um, all of these different things. So before I got to Jacobs, I went to the North Carolina School of the Arts.
Mhm.
And when I got into that school, I got off the wait list and I got there. I was definitely the worst person, worst player in the studio. And so I just
Mhm.
had this scrappy attitude of whatever people put in front of me, I'm going to nail it. Like, I'm going to
Mhm.
practice for a bajillion hours and I'm going to study for a bajillion hours. I'm not going to have friends. I'm just going to, like, I'm
Uh,
going to do it. Um, because I love this. I love music,
mhm.
and that's it. Um,
Mhm.
so I didn't question it. I mean, I had the I learned about William Grant Still, and that was about it in
Mhm.
terms of black composers. Um, but then I think it wasn't until the second year of my master's at
Mhm.
Northwestern that I started to understand. And I think this is I'm maybe an advocate um, for cognitive therapy because I didn't even realize many of the things until I started going to therapy, and
Mhm.
we deconstructed all of these insecurities that I was having and started thinking about, well, where does this come from? Why do you feel like you can't talk to that conductor? Why
Mhm.
do you feel like you can't say anything in class? What is so whatever, you know?
Mhm.
And then I like understood and I realized that not everyone feels like that, even if they do work hard, or even if they don't feel like they are the best or whatever. It was more than
Mhm.
my abilities or my actual um, intelligence level or anything like that. It was
Mhm.
an entire system that I was trying to prove that I belonged in.
Mhm.
Uh, and because of that, so that's incredibly anxiety inducing in a lot of
Mhm.
different ways and makes you think about a lot of things that other people just don't have to think about, and that goes back to the idea of survival, versus thriving.
Mhm.
And I think in many ways I had always been sort of um, encapsulated by just trying to survive rather than thinking I can thrive. Um,
Mhm.
so, as a result of that epiphany, which I'm very thankful to
Mhm.
Northwestern Caps, my therapist there,
Mhm.
um, that epiphany, I then started doing research,
Mhm.
and the first person that I came across actually after a conversation with Aaron Dworkin, who is the founder of Sphinx, the
Mhm.
Sphinx organization. Um, he told me about Joseph Boulon, Chevalier de Saint George,
Mhm.
and I heard his music and I just wept. I cried
Mhm.
for I like probably an hour while I was listening to all of these symphonies and string quartets and all
Mhm.
of that, and I it blew my mind in a way that I don't think I could have possibly understood when I was in undergrad because I was so just trying to survive.
Mhm.
Um, and I think there was always an inherent feeling that I was by myself in this, even though I didn't
Mhm.
know it. But hearing his music made me understand that I was not alone and that I had never been alone,
Mhm.
because the second name you mentioned in your um, music history synopsis was Mozart, Bach,
Mhm.
Mozart, whatever, Beethoven. Um, and Joseph Boulon came before Mozart.
Mhm.
And so to understand that there are hundreds of years of um, classical musicians from the African diaspora
Mhm.
was made me feel immediately like I was a part of a community.
Mhm.
Immediately, just and it felt like I was getting a 300-year-old hug. that I had needed since birth.
Mhm.
So that is how I first got into understanding the importance of diversity, and it got, you know, pretty complicated from there, I think, because then you start to understand all of the intersections and all of the confusing perspectives that so many different people have, and then trying to navigate your way into making meaningful change, um, and realizing that there is no one way of that necessarily. There's no one black perspective. There's no one POC perspective on what that even means.
Mhm.
So, yeah, but that's sort of how it started, I guess.
Well, it's interesting that you sort of bring that up in that timeline because Joseph Boulong is mentioned in your TED Talk that you did at Northwestern, which always stuck with me because that was the first time I was introduced
Hmm.
to Joseph Boulong, obviously, because, he was
Right.
never discussed in my music history curricula. Um, and it kind of blew my mind in a way because I was like, whoa, like like
Yeah.
that's Mozart.
Right.
But it goes beyond just whether or not um who predated whom. It's in some aspects of my music theory education, I was taught to understand things in sort of like a musical common language, or
Hmm.
it comes out of the Penn School, Dr. Biros, um, at Northwestern, sort of this idea of common schemata that is used among composers um, in this sort of, I don't want to say linguistic because that's obviously conflating a couple things, but in sort of this, you know, like Lego pieces that you assemble to, create structures that are commonly understood by people
Hmm.
um, within your culture community. And listening back to Joseph Boulong, I couldn't help but think, well, obviously that's not exclusive to um, race. I mean, it's not, there were obviously people of different backgrounds and ethnicities and races living in Europe at that time who were, in all likelihood, consuming that same kind of music. So it shouldn't surprise me um, that a composer such as him existed at the
Hmm.
time. But I wonder if in your research or your sort of journey through this, that you can trace any sort of lineage of composers who we don't talk about today, but that come from Europe as contemporaries of the people we sort of canonize but don't discuss.
Yeah. So your question is there like a through line with all of the
Mm-hmm.
people that we see
Yes.
that have sort of been erased?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Not that I have noticed.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think the through line is that they are. This sounds dumb. The through line is that they are not white men,
Mm-hmm.
because the other there are also, Hispanic composers from that
Mm-hmm.
time period. There are female composers from that time period,
Mm-hmm.
um, and the whole idea of what a composer is or was at that time was just centered around, being a white man.
Mm-hmm.
um, and so anyone that was not was erased.
Mm-hmm.
And if I were to say something in particular about um, the composers of the African diaspora from Europe,
Mm-hmm.
it would be that perhaps they were there for a myriad of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So like Joseph Boulon was the son of a slave,
Mm-hmm.
and her white master. And I think that there are many stories like that, throughout history, outside of music and everything. But the interesting thing about Joseph Boulon is that he had access to aristocracy. He had access
Mm-hmm.
to instruments, to fencing, to um,
Mm-hmm.
a violin,
Mm-hmm.
to all of these different things.
Which I guess is fair
And
to say stuff that was only accessible to, you know, white people of means per
right,
se.
exactly.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so, because of that, I think there are, in cases like his, there are many cases in which that person that was the son of, a slave and their master,
Mm-hmm.
um, would have not had those opportunities,
Mm-hmm.
because the master would either be embarrassed or um, just think that he would be shunned by society or something like that. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think that there's perhaps something remarkable in the fact that giving him access to those certain things
Mm-hmm.
is what allowed him to develop such skill and to go as far as he did, even though he was then sort of cut off after a while. So
Yeah.
I guess that would be perhaps the through line, is that um, there are people that were given access, and because of that they were able to thrive, therefore I think in many ways proving that it is not really about your race. Like, the music doesn't belong to anyone,
Mm-hmm.
um, but that your love and ability can be cultivated, um, and by having awareness.
Mm-hmm. And you took your to that point, you sort of took your awareness out of your own self-discovery
Hmm.
to, actually bring this issue forward in the Northwestern community. I, I mentioned your TED Talk already, which I'm going to link to people if you don't mind,
Sure.
because I think it's brilliant. But you also started a petition
Hmm.
while you were a master's student at Northwestern, um, to push for revisions to the curriculum, and it got hundreds of signatures. What kind of response did you feel like you got from, not students, because the students seem to have a positive response considering half the school signed it, but more so administration and professors and sort of the people in charge of setting that standard top down, I should say, um,
Mm.
when you presented that?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you it was really disappointing. It was
Mm-hmm.
really um, saddening, and I think that it slowed me down, honestly, um, after I left Northwestern, because it took a lot of hope out of my heart.
Mm-hmm.
Because um, I don't know. I mean, I'll just be specific. I mean, to hear people in the administration and on the faculty um, say that it's just not possible, or even that it's not important, that it's not relevant, that it's not something that is their problem,
Mm-hmm.
basically, um, was really hurtful, especially after having hundreds of people sign the signature. It was, I
Mm-hmm.
don't remember the exact number, but it was over 60% of the student body.
Mhm.
There were a couple of students that said they wouldn't sign it, which is, that's their prerogative. It was surprising to me because I felt like it was,
Mhm.
to me, it was foolproof what I was
Mhm.
asking for. I wasn't asking for, and this is not even me, like, this was a group of us, like,
Mhm.
that um, had really thought it out. We weren't asking for a specific thing. We
Mhm.
were asking for any anything.
Mhm.
And we then gave a lot of examples of things that they could do. You
Mhm.
know, certain things are, to me, completely harmless and could be very helpful.
Mhm.
Having more examples in oral skills, and then including the name of the composer that you where you found the excerpt or something. Like,
Which
to
is
me, that,
effectively no added burden,
right, there are
because
still
it's
scale degrees in Samuel
right.
Coleridge Taylor's music. You know,
Right.
and so I think that was disheartening to me. But I will say that I think that all of the people that were not supportive
Mhm.
didn't understand what I was saying. They thought
Mhm.
that I was asking for 100% of music to be by black people, or
Mhm.
something like that. And it's just not. But it's the fact that there shouldn't be a single student that goes through any institution of higher learning in music that knows no black composers.
Mhm.
Like, that's a start.
And you know what? If they do, here's the wild thing too. It's like if they do, it's probably out of like some sort of coverage of jazz history,
Right.
which is
Right.
that's a rich black music tradition, but that's clearly not the whole picture, and it's
Right.
sort of fragmented into those pieces. I mean, I remember, I don't know what you had to go through when you were a master's student, but we had our 3 courses of Western music history, and then we had world music cultures. It's like sort of pigeonholed into um like 1 quarter where you cover everything that's not the Western music canon. And it's like the discussion of, while some professors in the Western music history curriculum brought up the issue of like, oh, what, like we did a women composers project once where we wrote about a female composer in the Romantic period.
Mhm.
Um, that was great, and I learned something from it. But it's like I have felt like, and maybe this is something you were pushing for because I don't remember, but like the discussion about people other than the white men in the canon doesn't need to be reserved for 1 quarter where you try to cram it all in,
Right.
but it can be incorporated into the discourse had throughout music history
Right.
in just sort of the broader Western music sense, you
Yeah,
know?
exactly. And there were just all sorts of, I think the core of what I'm trying to say is that there were just all sorts of reasons why we couldn't do it,
Mhm.
couldn't do anything. And I just didn't want to hear that. There was
Mhm.
no reason to hear that. Like, let's talk about what we can do.
Mhm.
Because I had people that thought
Mhm.
that we were talking about, like, okay, well, we don't have time in this class to discuss Indian ragas. And I'm like,
Mhm.
that is, we're not talking about quote unquote world music. We're still talking
Mhm.
about Western classical music, but contributions to that, you know.
Mhm.
And so that was a whole conversation that we had to have. And then I'm like, well, it's not that. And then there
Mhm.
are, um, you know, various other professors that just didn't want to get it. I think they didn't want to get it. So it's like, oh,
Mhm.
but this isn't going to work. And as a professor now, I understand that changing your curricula is a very difficult thing to do and it takes a lot
Mhm.
of thought. And I do understand that, but that
Mhm.
doesn't change the fact that you should like
Mm-hmm.
that you should try. Um, One thing, I don't know if I'm jumping the gun or not, but since then I have actually found one professor at Ithaca College that is doing really amazing things with this concept in particular, in terms of
Mm-hmm.
diversifying her curriculum. And she's doing it through something that she's calling case studies.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of there being a curriculum in which you have to work through chronologically, and there are these people that you need to know, and there are these, whatever's that you need to sort of check boxes off. Um, she has everyone working in groups all the time,
Mm-hmm.
and she pairs people that have complementary strengths. So if one person is really
Mm-hmm.
good at compiling information, if one person's really passionate about um, like learning, a specific thing, like if so that whoever's in the group, they can all sort of bolster each other's spirits, basically. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but within that, they still go through history, but they have to pick a composer piece, um, or something from that time period, in which they study deeply the piece, the performers, the historical context, the
Mm-hmm.
cultural context, um, the greater implications, every facet of whatever
Mm-hmm.
that is. And then they come together, and all of the different groups in the class are teaching each other about all of these things throughout history. So that doesn't mean that actually doesn't even mean that they have to be constricted to Western classical music, because if
Mm-hmm.
they're studying the connections of a different type of music, a quote unquote world music or something, if they're studying the
Mm-hmm.
connections or the influences of that music from classical music, then they're still studying contemporaries of those composers or musicians.
Mm-hmm.
And the the reception from students has been completely amazing. I have some of my saxophone students coming back and talking to me about composers and performers that I just never knew about, that they
That's
have
incredible.
now created podcasts about and done all of these
Mm-hmm.
crazy things about. And so I think that that is really the future of
Mm-hmm.
education, in terms of being equitable and allowing for a natural diversity.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I'm trying to work that into my saxophone studio actually now. I'm not 100% sure how, but I'm working on it.
Well, you brought up Ithaca College, which is where you currently teach.
Yeah.
Um, you have your saxophone studio. Do you teach other courses beyond saxophone lessons?
No, really. I mean, I teach my studio individual private lessons. I do repertoire and pedagogy class, which is basically
Mm-hmm.
studio class.
Right.
Um, and then I coach chamber music when there's room in my load for it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's what I'm doing now. Previously, though, at my former institution, which was Baldwin Wallace University, I
Mm-hmm.
was teaching my saxophone students, but I was also, you'll laugh at me as an actual jazzer, I was a director of jazz studies there. Um,
Oh yeah,
and
you had brought that up at one point.
right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Um, so with that, I did a lot of, I mean, I taught history of jazz. I um, taught improvisation, which there was only one improvisation class, so it didn't get,
Mm-hmm.
too advanced. I ran the big band. I ran combos,
Mm-hmm.
all on top of teaching my private
Right.
students. So it was
Yeah.
pretty much an impossible job, but that's where I was coming from before. So this is much nicer for me,
Mm-hmm.
and possible to do.
True. Well, that was all to say, as um, as a saxophone teacher, and teaching studio classes and rep, how do you incorporate these issues that, you care about with diversity and sort of an equitable, more historically sort of contextualized look at
Mm-hmm.
the classical canon? How do you incorporate that into your studio as a teacher?
Yeah. It's really difficult
Mm-hmm.
um, for several reasons. One is that I'm young and I don't know if this is exactly the right way to say it, but I haven't proven myself yet
Mm-hmm.
as a teacher. And so
Mm-hmm.
there are certain things that your students have to get behind you about. They have to
Mm-hmm.
believe that if you do something different, that they're still going to get to the same outcome in terms
Mm-hmm.
of being able to get into a master's program at Michigan or Northwestern or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I can say that it's been really hard for me to actually put it into my saxophone curriculum, partially because the saxophone is so young
Mm-hmm.
and runs on the periphery of classical music.
Right.
So even these composers that have been erased, most of them didn't write for saxophone.
No.
And that's something that I find is a little bit of cognitive dissonance just for me as an artist in general. It's like I'm advocating for all this stuff and I don't have anything to play.
Well,
um,
that's why you take it upon yourself to write your
right.
own music for the saxophone, which is a true story.
Right. I
That
mean, I literally,
yeah,
and yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, I'm like, okay, well, I guess I'll write it,
yeah.
and I'll commission it. And now that
Mm-hmm.
I'm with young concert artists, which is a whole nother subject,
Yeah.
I have a debut recital next year, and I have two premieres. One by Saad Haddad, who incorporates a lot of Arabic music and quarter tones and all that kind of stuff into his music, and I have a piece by Carlos Simon, who is
Mm-hmm.
an African American composer from Atlanta, and is just completely amazing. And so, for a young concert artist debut recital, that is a lot of new music. That's a big deal
Yeah.
because it's such a
Mm-hmm.
quote unquote conservative organization. And
Mm-hmm.
so, but I'm trying to use my platform now to create the repertoire, to create
Mm-hmm.
those types of things. But we have to do it in real time as
Mm-hmm.
saxophonists. So, with my studio and with teaching in general, a big part of it for me is showing up. Like,
Mm-hmm.
is being at the camp where the students
Mm-hmm.
are so that they see where the black students are so that they see
Mm-hmm.
someone that is doing what classical saxophone, and so that they can maybe have that first experience of that 300-year-old hug I was talking about,
Mm-hmm.
of, oh, okay, I'm not the first one to ever do this, I don't feel alone in this.
Exactly.
And then to perform. Like when I go to play with the Cleveland Orchestra, I love when I see young black kids in the audience and then they look at me
Mm-hmm.
and they're just like, oh, I see it. I totally see it. It's so
Mm-hmm.
cool.
That's
Um,
awesome.
I will also say that it's really hard for me because that feels like it feels in a way like selling out sometimes, because
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the only way that my voice can be loud enough for anyone to hear it is if the white people at the top trust my musical um,
Mm-hmm.
output and my musical taste and all these different types of things.
Mm-hmm.
And so to do that, I feel like I have to sort of just grind it out, follow the path that is there, even if that path is problematic, until I
Hmm.
get to the top, and then I can perhaps make a difference if I create a petition,
Right.
because as a student at Northwestern, I mean, I was just going to graduate eventually, and
Hmm.
then they can sort of BS me until I leave, and
Hmm.
then take credit for my accomplishments in their,
Sure.
whatever they put out in their alumni newsletters and whatever.
Hmm.
But they're not putting in there that I stood up for something when I was there. They're putting in there that, oh, he's now the first saxophonist to join Young Concert Artist roster. Great.
Right. Hmm.
Um, so all that to say, I'm still really working on it, and I have a lot of conflicting feelings about it, uh, because I want to make the as much of a lasting impact as I possibly can, and I'm trying to see the difference between the short term and just changing stuff, and the
Hmm.
long term with getting to the point where I can change more things in a more succinct way.
Hmm.
So that's not a great answer, but that's where I am, honestly.
Well, that story about playing in the Cleveland Orchestra, about how, young black kids feel like they have a role model.
Right.
I think it's really powerful. And I'm sure that's like the most rewarding feeling for you to feel like you can, you know, uh, sort of be that for someone else.
Hmm.
And frankly, I'm sure for a lot of people who are young, coming up in music, they don't realize that they've been shut out until they see that,
Mm.
until they see like a black soloist with the Cleveland Orchestra. And, that's incredible. But also, I want to sort of probe it a little more because, in a different sense, do you ever think about, and this is also coming back from your TED Talk, because in your TED Talk you showed pictures of
Uh,
you with, you know, the symphonic wind ensemble, and you are the only black person in the ensemble.
yep.
But to like sort of turn the discussion about role models on its head, are you worried about and think about tokenism
Mm.
with these institutions, or, you know, as yourself as a black classical musician?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can't be a black person in America and not be worried about tokenism at
Hmm.
all, because um, I was just listening to a panel of conductors, black conductors,
Hmm.
actually talk about this, and what I really liked came from Thomas Wilkins, who's the director of orchestras at Indiana University now.
Hmm.
He said that if they hire you for the first time because you're black, that's on them.
Hmm.
If they hire you a second time, that's because you were great.
Hmm.
Um, and so I can just say that that also puts a lot of pressure on you, as a
Hmm.
performer, because they're zeroing in on you as someone
Hmm.
that they don't see, like, this person doesn't look like they belong here.
Hmm.
This person doesn't seem like the right person to be doing this. And so it's just one of these things is not like the other. There's literally zooming in on you. And then if you make a
Hmm.
mistake, if you miss that entrance, if you do whatever, then it's like,
Hmm.
yeah, we shouldn't have done that. Which
Hmm.
just makes every single performance in some ways not fun. Like it
Hmm.
gets to the point where it is exhausting because you just want to make music, but then you are thinking about all of these other things that are coming along with it. Um,
Hmm.
so yeah, I mean, I'm worried about it, but I also understand that there's no way out of it. Um,
Hmm.
and so certain things really mean a lot to me. Like when when I perform with Cleveland, the things that people say, people in the orchestra, or if the review comes out or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
those things end up for me sometimes meaning too much, because I'm just
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, okay, like it was fine, it was okay. Like even if I felt great about it, it almost
Right.
doesn't matter, because I'm like, well, I don't know. I mean, did they think that it was worth what I thought it was worth, because they might have been zeroing in on me in a certain way, or
Mm-hmm.
something like that. So um, I worry about tokenism. I think that it is hard to escape the pressures of it,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm still working on it, because there's also the fact that I'm a saxophonist, and
Mm-hmm.
like that's maybe the less socially relevant part of this situation, but it's also
Maybe.
something that, like, being a saxophonist, like they already think you're not going to be able to do you're not going to be able to keep up musically.
Well, right. It's like it's the added prejudice of like, well, the saxophone's already the outsider in sort of like a traditional classical sense, and it's like,
Right.
okay, now you got two different ways that you have to prove yourself.
Right. Yeah. So
Um,
you're showing up
and
as
it's
a tall, 6'5", 200-pound black man holding a saxophone. Like, that's loaded, man. That's loaded.
Mhm.
Especially, like I remember in my second year at Northwestern, like I changed my hair. I shed it. I closed it, or oh my gosh, closed it. I cut it because
Uh-huh.
because of quarantine, but I had it sort of going out, and it was looking more
Mhm.
how I wanted it to look. Like, as a black man, I just want it, like, have a little style or something. But if you show up, you're 6'5", 200-pound black man, and you got like hair that is not just like closely shaven, and
Mhm.
all these things. People have said to me, what do they think about your hair at the symphony? Someone said that to me. I mean, there's so many layers of it
Mhm.
that are already packed on before you play a note.
Mhm.
So when you play that first note, it has to be excuse my language, but it just has to be like, damn. Or
Mhm.
else, like, it's just like, oh, okay, he kept up. But
Right.
you have to go beyond. And honestly, when I play with Cleveland, or when I play recitals, or honestly just show up to work,
Mhm.
I'm so nervous all the time. I'm
Mhm.
so nervous to get a bad, uh, not review, but to have one of my students, say something in their comments at the end of the semester, like I was not this enough or not that enough, because
Mhm.
while for most teachers that would be constructive criticism, for me as a
Mhm.
26-year-old black professor at Ithaca College of music, of
Mhm.
saxophone, that could be, oh, we took a chance on him and he's not doing what he's supposed to do.
Right.
Um,
Mhm.
so, yes, to answer your question.
Well, it it's it, yeah, I mean, that's also real, and something that, you know, I don't think, if you're not in that position yourself, you can't fully appreciate, what that pressure feels like.
Hmm.
Um,
Right.
and it it's really sobering to think about that. And then you run into, I don't want to keep you too long. I know
Oh,
we've
sure.
just been, but there's sort of that it, sort of circular chicken egg logic to me that always comes out of discussions like this,
Hmm.
which is always, you know, it really comes down to an affirmative action debate that,
Hmm.
again, can be thrown into hours of different discussion. But to me, it always comes down to this debate of, well, it's like, is it unfair that we're, you know, affirmatively bringing in or taking a chance on, or whatever you want to call it,
Hmm.
because, people will call it whatever they want, but bringing in people of diverse backgrounds, bringing in unknown composers to a curriculum, or previously unknown composers into a curriculum, or sort of making a conscious effort to elevate them. Sort of the talking point that I don't necessarily like is that it's at the diminution of quality for some reason.
Right.
It's like that's just it's a really just, I think it's a pretty cheap out to say that, and there's already an undercurrent of sort of bigotry involved to say that you bring just something in at the expense of something else.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even an undertone. Like that's racist.
Right.
That's literally
right. But you brought it up in your TED Talk too, because you were like, the M Prize, which has a panel of esteemed musicians of all backgrounds. It's like that is not it became one of the most prestigious chamber music competitions, right?
Yeah.
Like that's not at the expense of quality, as this like notion that people get twisted into a lot.
Right.
Whether through ignorance or malice. And to pull it back to like my original point about, the chicken egg, to bring people in, and how do you sort of encourage young people of different backgrounds from just, a white, typically upper middle class means that get introduced to classical music, how you bring those people in. You sort of need the role models to exist first before people can feel like they're welcome in that community. And and I hope that through these discussions we can make clear how important that is, and also sort of dismantle that notion that like none of that has to be at the sacrifice of anything.
Right. And I mean, there's also the fact that the role models are already there. You don't have to, like, I think what's happening right now, is that we're just raising Black voices. We're not all of a sudden creating them.
Right.
Right. And it doesn't even, you don't even have to educate people with classical music. There are all types of ways that you can let people know that the quote unquote classical arts, or the arts in general, have been led by Black figures forever. Knowing about the writings of, Angela Davis, and understanding how the philosophies of James Baldwin and all of these different things, knowing about Black history is something that helps you just not feel like the quality is going to be the issue. Because
of course
it's just not. And like in the classical world, I think it's that whole thing that I was just talking about, in terms of sort of people having a magnifying glass on people that don't look like they should be there, quote unquote. Because I've worked with, and I don't claim to be like a seasoned vet with orchestras, but in the time that I have worked with orchestras already, I've only worked with one Black conductor, and it was amazing. But I've worked with a lot of other types, other composer or conductors of different backgrounds, and if a white conductor makes a mistake, people are just like used to it. I've been in performances where the conductor is just wrong, just so off, so wrong. Their technique is bad. They're conducting the wrong time signatures. They are like cueing the wrong people. They don't do things that they said they were going to do in rehearsal, and then they get mad at you after the concert because they messed up.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're a black conductor, if you are a female conductor, you don't have the license to do that. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not a quality thing, because the quality of white performers, artists, whatever, is always just like assumed in a
Mm-hmm.
way. It's like, oh, well, this is going to be fine. It's not. Oh, well, I won't say that. It's just like they're not looking to say, oh, this is a white person doing this. Let's see how they do.
Mm-hmm.
You
Like the
know
identities, the identity is it, it, it's detached from the product that they put
exactly,
out, as
exactly,
opposed to it, it you wish that the identity were detached from the product for everyone else, but that only comes through education and time and chipping away at those old, like, you know bigoted notions that sort
yeah,
of
yeah,
project extra baggage that doesn't need to exist onto that product. And what you were going to say with, like, if a white conductor messes up, it's like, it's a mistake, he's human. It's like, well, yeah, everyone's human. It doesn't matter what your skin color is. Like,
right,
if a black conductor messes up, they're going to mess up just like anyone else, but it's like they might not get the same free pass.
right, exactly. And that's what
Which
these conductors that I was talking about earlier were talking about. Black conductors saying that when you have that first chance, you might be the first black conductor or performer that orchestra has ever hired.
Mhm.
And so you can't you can't mess up.
Right.
um and that can be paralyzing for
Mhm.
people. Like, that's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah. Well, Stephen, we have been talking for over an hour now, and it's I mean I love it because I know it was like, oh, we're going to talk for like 30-45 minutes, but
Right.
I just love the I love the sort of different angles that this discussion can take, and I think it's
Right.
really important. So I appreciate you know sitting down with me and having this dialogue that I think needs to happen. um I'll let you have the last word. If you could leave you know sort of one parting thought about how we can not just grow from the situation that's happening politically, but just how we can take it into our music education as advocates,
uh,
what would you leave us with?
sure. Oh man. Okay. One thing. um I think it would have to be an overarching thing
Hmm.
that, um for white listeners, I guess it would be to understand that black people are never comfortable.
Hmm.
The fact that, um, the entire idea of America is built on black people being less than is something that we can't turn off.
Hmm.
And so when you are teaching, when you are whatever, performing, when you are curating a concert, when you're doing anything, just know that you have that privilege to turn it off, and that there are other people that don't, and that
Hmm.
you can't forget about that after this quote unquote moment is over.
Hmm.
Um, However, I don't think that this moment will be over. I really don't.
No.
I think that there's something different about this time where
Mm-hmm.
people sort of get it because the world is stopped. The coronavirus
Mm-hmm.
has happened. And so people have the time to think, they have the time to understand. And so I think that keeping it at the forefront of your mind for the rest of your
Mm-hmm.
life is what we have
Mm-hmm.
to do.
Right.
If we ever want there to be equality, because the things that we're
Mm-hmm.
talking about, and I know we're keeping continuing to go on, but the things that we're talking about here are not um, they're not something that your school can just do one thing
Mm-hmm.
and fix. This is the entire life of a black person that is like riddled with anxiety, code switching,
Mm-hmm.
trying to fit in, and all of that. And the initiatives that you take can actually make someone's life better.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I guess that would be the thing that I leave is that it's not, to me, it's not political, honestly, at all. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and to just keep it going with an understanding that these are actual people's lives,
Mm-hmm.
whether they are dying or whether they are just trying to thrive.